All right, Alexander, let's do a video on the Biden-Putin summit, just kind of wrapping everything up and to put things in order after this video call, this Zoom call summit. I guess the big news that I'm hearing, and it's speculation right now, I don't know how concrete it is, but it's the fact that Russia is going to be invited to some sort of summit with NATO under Biden's urging. And they're looking to kind of I don't want to say make peace, but just kind of freeze everything where it is. Calm tensions down, I think, were the words that Biden used. I don't know if this is really going to happen, if this is accurate reporting, or what's going on here.
Right. Well, I think we can actually unpack this. What happened, and we've got now quite a lot of reporting interestingly enough, more the British than the US media, because I suspect that people within the administration are now more comfortable talking about these things, specifically to the Financial Times, than they are to the US media, because they don't want to provoke a firestorm of criticism in the US. Anyway, they had this situation which looked like it was deteriorating in Ukraine. There was talk of a potential Ukrainian offensive, a Russian counteroffensive. The chief of the Russian General Staff, General Gerasimov, has given more warnings today about what would happen if there was a Ukrainian offensive in the Donbass. So the Pentagon, all those officials got together in a huddle in Washington to work out what the US response would be if there was a war in Ukraine. And the Pentagon made it absolutely clear that they're not prepared to intervene militarily in Ukraine, that it would be a disaster, that the US would face defeat there, and that the only way out would be to go nuclear, and that would be going all the way to World War III. So that the military option was ruled out. Then they looked at the sanctions, and it turned out that in terms of a sanctions package, only 2 sanctions were available. One was disconnecting Russia from SWIFT. We've discussed this many times. The Russians have all their backup plans. They can deal with that. And I mean, it would be a disruption for them, but it would not be the financial blockade on Russia that Victoria Nuland is talking about. And the other one, and this is apparently the centerpiece sanctions, are cancelling Nord Stream 2. We always get back to Nord Stream 2. The problem is Germany, Europe need Nord Stream 2 far more than Russia does. We've talked about this so often on these programs that it's becoming tiresome, frankly. But to repeat quickly and again, Nord Stream 2 is a German project, not a Russian project. The Germans and the Europeans need Russian natural gas, and if they don't get it, they're facing blackouts. So what happened was they realized that there's a war in Ukraine. The US is basically finding itself with a very weak hand. So they wheeled out again the old man. I'm sorry to put it as brutally as this. He spoke to Putin in this summit, in this virtual summit, as I said, from a prepared text. And now they're telling the Europeans, look, we've got to have this NATO summit meeting with Putin, with the Russians. We've got to try and find some way of giving the Russians what they want in terms of their red lines. And the latest word we're getting is that Biden is going to talk to Zelensky possibly today and tell Zelensky, look, you've got to accept you're not going to get NATO membership for at least 10 years. 10 years means, in effect, never. And at the same time, you've got to move forward with granting autonomy to the Donbass. We're not anywhere close to a resolution of this problem. And as you absolutely rightly say, the hardliners in Washington, in the State Department, the Victoria Nulands, are still there. They're going to do everything they possibly can to torpedo this. The Ukrainians are going to want to torpedo this also. The Baltic states, the Poles, the British, they're all going to be working flat out to try to turn things round. I don't personally expect any real agreement to come out anytime soon, or perhaps even ever. But it looks as if, for the moment, the administration, or one part of the administration, perhaps the more sane part of the administration, and the Pentagon want to put this whole crisis on ice and want to basically cut Ukraine off because they have realized the weakness of the hand they're playing from. So I think this is really where we stand.
Yeah, I'll get to Ukraine in a bit, but real quick question. Who is the U.S. to cancel Nord Stream 2? I mean, I didn't know that Nord Stream 2 is running all the way from Russia to the United States. I mean, this is incredible.
It's a very good point,
Cancel. You said cancel. Yeah.
Cancel. I mean, absolutely. Not just freeze it, but cancel it entirely. I mean, it's already built. It's able to channel gas, but this big pipeline would be there and it would just be empty. I mean, it wouldn't be pumping anything. I mean, it's a bizarre situation. And in fact, what we're getting reports from places like Politico is that there's actually been some pushback, a weak pushback. Always the Europeans are desperately weak about these things, but the Germans pushed back a bit. They said, well, look, we don't really see evidence that there's a war in the Donbass coming. The French apparently ditto, though the French aren't particularly keen on Nord Stream 2 for somewhat different reasons. But anyway, there was some pushback from the Europeans, but it is the US, again, which is bringing up the topic of Nord Stream 2, because in all other respects, this business of disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, it's not really the game-changing sanction that many people think it is. And in all other respects, if you don't close Nord Stream 2, well, there are no shots in your locker. So that's what they're doing. And ultimately, it's not America's right to cancel Nord Stream 2. The sanctions package, or this talked about sanctions package, has to be cleared by the European Council, and there may be some resistance there, but no doubt they will eventually agree, as they always do. But ultimately, as I said, the whole thing looks like a whole lot of empty threats, sanctions which would be far more damaging potentially for the Europeans than for the Russians themselves, especially in the long term. And in any sane world, we're not sure how sane the world is at the moment, at least the western half of it, but in any sane world, the fact that we are talking about these absurd sanctions, these utterly, counterproductive sanctions, ought to be a major disincentive on starting any adventures in Ukraine. Now, there are some people, one gets the sense that they're mainly the uniformed military in the Pentagon and perhaps some of the people in the economic agencies in the US who seem to have got this. But of course, the neocons, the hardliners, those kind of people never will. From their point of view, any concession, any retreat is heresy, and they will want to press on. So I'm afraid we're probably going to get negotiations of some kind. There's going to be talk. There's also going to be massive criticism, I predict, of the administration that they caved to Putin and all of that. And I suspect we're going to have talks, and those talks are going to go nowhere fast or nowhere at all. And at some point in the future, we're going to be back where we were, where we started. There's a famous line, not a line, it's actually a quote from the Russian playwright Chekhov, who says, if you have a loaded gun, if you put a loaded gun on the table in the first act of a play, by the fifth act, that gun is going to go off. I mean, it's inevitable. So they've now got this sanctions package on the table. Sooner or later, counterproductive as it is, I predict the Newlands will get their way and we'll see those sanctions imposed because the fact that they're there, there's going to be this constant agitation to have them. And sooner or later, I predict there will be a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass because that's the logic of this situation, unless there is a change of government in Kiev and a complete reorientation in Ukrainian policy, which at the moment looks unlikely.
Yeah, here's how I think it'll go down. first of all, the EU leaders are just they're such bullies and cowards because they bully their citizens. So they always punch down towards their citizens and they bully their citizens. But when the U.S. comes along, then they just fold. They're just such weaklings, and they just lick the boots of people like Newland. And even Joe Biden. I mean, what a bunch of weaklings and bullies these EU leaders are. They are just the worst of both worlds. My God, they're worse. They're worse than the Biden White House. Remember, we've had discussions: who's worse, van der Leyen or Biden, or the EU or the Biden administration? The EU takes the cake because anyone in the EU would just tell the U.S. if they came along and said we're going to cancel Nord Stream 2. Anyone with even a moderate set of balls, of courage, of anything, of dignity, of integrity would say, go buzz off. But no, they're not going to do it. They are not going to do it. So I agree with you. Eventually, they're going to probably cancel Nord Stream 2. Interesting, if Merkel was around, I bet you she would provide some pushback to Biden. That's just my hunch there. But now, whatever. They're just going to accept whatever the U.S. tells them sooner or later. The interesting thing about what's going to happen, in my opinion, is that they'll eventually cancel Nord Stream 2, but it's not going to make a difference because Russia's not going to say, oh, Nord Stream 2 is canceled, so now we're just going to pump everything through Ukraine again. And here you go, Ukraine. We're going to quadruple your transit fees, and we'll pay you 10x on top of that because, well, we just don't have Nord Stream 2 anymore. No, they're still going to shut down the Ukraine pipeline. It's still going to go out of business in 2024, so it's not going to really make a difference. Eventually, Zelensky is just going to be toast. I mean, he is drifting to the point where he's just going to be either changed, ousted, coup d'etat, you name it. I don't know what's going to happen to Zelensky, but I think the guy is just absolute toast. And there's just going to be this massive power vacuum in Kiev, and something is going to happen. Something's going to fly. Someone's going to launch something towards the east, and all bets are off. This is just a complete freaking debacle because, they're going to cut Ukraine loose or they're going to cut Ukraine off. Even if Biden cuts Ukraine off, then Ukraine what does Zelensky do? He's dead man walking.
You're right on every single point. Let's start with the EU leaders. You're absolutely right. What they do is they cave always to the Washington neocons and then take out the anger that they internally feel about the fact that they are doing that. They take out their anger on their own people because that's what's going to happen. You cut off Nord Stream 2. It's not going to mean, as you absolutely rightly say, more Russian gas going through Ukraine. The days of Ukraine as a transit state are numbered. The Russians have actually made that absolutely clear, and they've also made it absolutely clear this is not connected any longer to Nord Stream 2. What will happen is not that there will be more gas flowing to Europe through Ukraine. It is that there will be less gas flowing to Europe, period. That's what's going to happen. They're not going to get the gas from Nord Stream 2, and they're not going to get the gas flowing from Ukraine. There will be less gas. And what do the Europeans do then? Because they need that gas. And I think this is where the problems come back to the fact that the Europeans do not understand the gas industry and gas politics. Firstly, the Russians are now building pipelines to China. So we got a pipeline already operating, sending gas from Russia to China, and that will be increased. There's going to be a second pipeline, which is only a few years off, sending gas to China. But in the immediate term, even if gas through Ukraine and gas through Nord Stream 2 were to be stopped tomorrow, Russia today is a major producer of liquefied natural gas, and you would have Russian natural gas going from the Arctic immediately to Asian customers instead of European ones. That's what's going to happen. That's what's coming. And what will happen is that European gas prices in this kind of situation are simply going to go through the roof. Already, when there was talk about this sanctions package, when there was talk about the US imposing and the Europeans imposing this sanctions package, what happened? Were the markets scared off the ruble? The ruble dipped by 0.4% and then immediately recovered. The immediate response of the markets was not a crash of the ruble. It was a massive hike in natural gas prices. They've fallen back again slightly because of the way in which the talks between Biden and Putin went. But it is the Europeans who are planting this bomb in this form of this sanctions package under themselves. And there doesn't seem to be any, well, I'm sure they understand it at some level, but they don't seem able to stand up to the Victoria Nuland's and tell them, well, shove off. This isn't your problem. We've got to mind our own people. I can remember in the early 1980s, there was the first Russian gas pipeline project, which, by the way, passed through Ukraine. That was when it was the Soviets. The Soviets was building pipelines in the early 1980s to pipe gas to Europe. And of course, this was a time of East-West tensions. There was the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. There were Soviet threats against the Solidarity movement in Poland. There was eventually the crackdown on the Solidarity movement in Poland. There was also a major tension over the deployment of US cruise and Pershing missiles. And the Reagan administration did exactly what the Americans are doing today. They came along and they told the Europeans, don't build this pipeline. We don't want you to have this pipeline. And what happened? The Europeans at that time said to the Americans, shove off. This is something that is vitally important to us, and we need it. And the leaders who did that, the leaders who spoke out, were obviously Helmut Schmidt and Helmut Kohl in Germany, François Mitterrand in France, and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And I remember that in those days, Margaret Thatcher, who was, of course, the Prime Minister of Britain, and it was British companies that were involved in parts of the pipeline construction, she was one of the most outspoken in telling the Americans to shove off. And those were leaders. Today, you don't get leaders in Europe. You get, as I said, bullies, as you rightly said, bullies who cave before the neocons and then take out their anger on their own people.
Yeah. And Zelensky? What do you think is going to happen to that
Zelensky,
guy?
I think you're absolutely right.
Now that they're throwing him under the bus. He doesn't see it? He doesn't see it? They're going to throw him under the bus?
He is a dead man walking. I mean, I think more and more Ukrainians understand that. I mean, that's another thing, which is, of course, it's a point you made in a program a couple of days ago, which is that the one thing you don't get from the Western media is any actual reporting of the internal situation in Ukraine. The fact that the economy there is sliding, the fact that inflation is exploding, the fact that living standards are falling, the fact that everybody you talk to in Ukraine who isn't in the political class sounds exhausted and completely demoralized, that there's now growing criticism in the Ukrainian media of Zelensky himself, and that there's apparently going to be a meeting in Vilnius of important Ukrainian power brokers, including the powerful oligarch Rinat Akhmetov and the former Interior Minister Arsen Avakov, and all the indications are that they're maneuvering now to get Zelensky out. So, I mean, it's one of the bizarre things that, as I said, all of that side of this crisis isn't being reported at all. But of course, removing Zelensky isn't going to solve any problems for Ukraine unless Ukraine eventually does that which it needs to do, which is actually move forward with the Minsk agreements and engage Russia in a realistic dialogue. The simple fact is, it's all very well saying countries, should be free to do and choose their policies as they like. But every country has to consider its circumstances, its situation. And if you look at geography, just look at the map, you see which country is most important to Ukraine. It is Russia. I mean, it's blindingly obvious. And all this talk about, there's some great principle at stake that Ukraine must be free and independent and must be free to make whatever choices it chooses. I mean, that just doesn't take into account the geographical, economic, and cultural realities. And the sooner Ukrainians themselves grasp that fact and grasp the nettle that they need to start talking constructively to Moscow, the better it will be for them. The danger is, just as the Europeans don't seem to be able to stand up to the Americans, just as in Washington, it's always the neocons who seem to win out on every sort of political battle. In Ukraine itself, it's always the nationalist hardliners who always seem to win every internal battle there. And the likelihood, therefore, is that what will happen is that Zelensky will be pushed aside, an even more hardline figure will take over. Sooner or later, that person will launch this offensive on the Donbass that we've been hearing about. That offensive will fall apart. The chief of the Russian General Staff has again today spoken about this. General Gerasimov has spoken about this. At that point, all those sanctions which we've been talking about, which are going to implode the European economy, are going to come into effect, and Ukraine will be partitioned. Now, from any logical, sensible, rational point of view, any halfway sane perspective, that ought to be something that ought to be a scenario you ought to be doing your absolute best to avoid. People like Douglas McGregor in the United States are saying that. People like some of the uniformed military in the United States are saying that. There are people like Macron who you suspect deep down understand it also. But the most extraordinary thing, the really disastrous thing, is that those people always seem to lose out against other people who insist on acting irrationally. So we've had a reprieve. Let's finish this by saying this. We had a reprieve from this Biden-Putin summit meeting. We've got some talks, but overall, the situation remains bleak. And all that this summit meeting, so far as I am concerned, has done is expose the fact that the West is playing this game now, this poker game with Russia over Ukraine, with an empty hand.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Russia has got all the leverage, and they're playing a very stupid game. The West is, just to wrap it up, the West, the United States and the EU, they're hostages to the neocons, and Ukraine, they're hostages to these hardline nationalist figures, these NAZIs, real NAZIs, and the neocons are aligned with these with these hardline figures in Ukraine. I know. What's the outcome to expect? It's as clear as day what's going to happen. What a real president in Ukraine would do is he would say, enough of this stupidity. We're gonna follow through on the Minsk agreements. We're going to start speaking with Russia, our neighbors to the north, and our neighbors who we have historical and familiar ties with. And we're going to tell the hardliners in the West to buzz off. That would be what a real leader does, but they're not. No one's going to do that.
That would be a real independent foreign. That would be a real independent. Exactly, that's a real independent. And it would be smart foreign policy. It was smart policy. It would be one calculated to serve the best interests of the people of Ukraine. But it's impossible to see how that can happen at the moment. The only prominent Ukrainian politician who advocates that is Viktor Medvedchuk, and he's under house arrest.
Yeah. It's really funny. In the United States, they go off and off about, ultra right wing and ultra right wing this and right wing militia that, and all they do is talk about that stuff. Meanwhile, they're the ones that are funding real deal ultra right-wing hardliners in Ukraine that are about to destabilize the whole of Europe.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
We'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com and go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Rumble, BitChute, Super U, and ODYSEE is where you will find all our videos. Take care.